Hello, and welcome to this session on thinking about end of life during front-end design, designing with reduced plastic and recycling in mind. My name is Melanie Nerona. I'm a senior editor at the Economist Intelligence Unit's Public Policy and Thought Leadership Division. Now, the issue of plastic pollution leaking into oceans and the challenges they pose are well established. And the issues range from entanglement of marine animals to the presence of microplastics and toxic contaminants in seafood and water, although more research still needs to be done on the wider health impacts. Now, in this session, we'll discuss solutions to address the issue of plastic pollution, but with a focus on product design. That is, designing to reduce the use of virgin plastics and use alternative materials in products and packaging, designing to enable reuse, which may still involve the use of plastic, but that would lead to a reduction in total virgin plastic consumed, and designing plastic materials that are easy to recycle. That is, designing for a circular economy. And to contribute to this discussion, we have three esteemed panelists. They are key stakeholders in the plastic industry and are really involved in thinking about solutions to the issue of plastic pollution. So I'm pleased to welcome here today Marco Ten Bruggencate, Commercial Vice President for Packaging and Specialty Plastics, EMEA at Dow. We have Richard Thompson, Professor of Marine Biology and Director of the Marine Institute at the University of Plymouth. And we have Burgess Davis, Vice President, Global Sustainable Packaging and Sustainability Strategy at PepsiCo. Welcome to our panelists. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today. Now, over the next 30 minutes or so, I'd like to split the discussion into about four sections, looking through the lens of product design, but designing to reduce, to reuse, and to recycle plastic. And then wrap up this session by touching on collaboration required to develop and deliver these solutions. So I want to start by talking about reducing the use of virgin plastics. And to set the scene and highlight why this discussion is so important, Richard, I want to turn to you. Could you start off by telling us why designing for end of life is so critical? Can it actually help reduce plastic waste and litter?
I think it's really essential that we design for end of life. I mean, it's very clear that plastics bring immense societal benefits. As a marine biologist, I also face the consequences of a lot of human actions in the environment. And it's very clear there are negative effects of plastic. The problem is really, or the solution, depending on which lens you look at it, we could achieve nearly all the benefits that plastics bring without these unintended consequences that you've highlighted of litter, of aesthetic damage, of harm to wildlife, of harm to economies. Typically with the challenges I face, if you think of extracting minerals from the ocean or extracting fish, the thing that we're doing is depleting or damaging the thing that us humans want. But with plastics, virtually none of the benefits are coupled to this harm. So it's absolutely about using plastics more smartly. It isn't about not using them. And the place where really we've let ourselves down, I think, is at the design stage, particularly since plastics are used in so many short-lived applications. I mean, 40% of all production is going essentially into single-use applications. Very short-lived benefit to society, a clear benefit, but a long-lived persistence as waste. And that's why it's really important that we get this circularity right and that we design with end of life in mind to reduce the quantity of waste and also the quantity of litter that's escaping to the environment. And that is about reduce, but it's also about designing for recyclability and reuse. So it's thinking about all of those things in the round together right from the design stage. Ironically, most of the product designers I speak to say that was never in the brief. And that's really regrettable. They were asked to design for functionality and aesthetics, but we're never asked to consider end of life.
That's great. Thank you, Richard, for really setting the scene. And I think the statement there is that we've been let down by sort of not designing from the very beginning. And Burgess, I want to turn to you next on to explore this a little bit more, and to understand of the three-pronged strategy of reduce, reuse, and recycle. At PepsiCo, how much importance is given to reducing the amount of plastic use in bottles or other packaging compared with reuse and recycling?
So thanks, Melanie. At PepsiCo, we have a three-pronged strategy as well. So we are focused on reduction, recycling, and what we call reinvention, which includes reuse. And you really have to be looking at solutions across all three. You cannot just look at a single area. For reduce, the way that we think about it at PepsiCo is across our portfolio, we're looking at different solutions to drive the most efficient use of our materials. As Richard said, I think that there's a smart way to use our materials, and as long as we're doing it in the most efficient way and in a circular way, I think that a lot of the benefits for our products and the consumers are preserved. We look at things from kind of lightweighting and ensuring that the materials are as kind of thin and efficient as possible. We're looking at solutions on our food side where we are really right sizing and ensuring that there's no additional materials or packaging that's used. We've got a technology that allows the product to be settled before it gets shipped. And so you reduce a lot of the air and additional packaging right in the manufacturing process before it even gets to the shelf and to the consumer. We're also looking at lots of other solutions and thinking more innovatively, where we've used maybe plastic as a good solution in the past. Where can we use paper or things that are very highly recyclable? We're also looking at solutions that might be more like adhesives instead of bringing plastic together to bind or combine products. How do we look at really efficient uses of things like adhesives that allow the consumer to still engage with the product in a way that they would expect, but it's without the additional materials required. We're even looking beyond plastics and looking at other sustainable and highly recyclable materials like aluminum, paper. We've even announced an effort with some partners, including Diageo last year, to create a paper bottle. So something that would enable consumers to continue to recycle within a paper stream is something that is very commonly and widely recyclable today. How do we find other solutions beyond plastics to either reduce and drive efficiency with our materials or ensure circularity in other materials?
Thank you, Burgess, for, I think, highlighting the need for efficient use of materials as well. Marco, I want to turn to you maybe to respond or build on what Burgess has just said. With the move to alternative materials, the move beyond plastics, that obviously goes against Dow's business model in a way. So how do you reconcile that global move or that shift away from plastics with your company's future growth?
Yeah, I think it's first of all, I just want to react to what Richard and Burgess said with respect to material use and the design. I fully agree. Plastics have been designed over the last couple of decades predominantly with the focus to use the least amount of resources and material and optimize the CO2 savings whilst maintaining that functionality brand owners like Burgess works for are looking for. Now, what we forgot in the progress in the process is the actual end of life. What we can't say with that though is that when you look at alternative materials, you need to be very clear that plastics still provide one of the best CO2 footprints when compared to many other materials. However, we need to bring in that design for the end of life element. And Richard clearly articulated that. I fully agree. It's very important to do that right from the start. And I can give you an example that Dow is very committed and spending a global or setting up a global footprint of design studios called Pack Studio, where we bring together brand owners, OEMs, but also our own customers to ultimately design, innovate, prototype, and actually test on machines new packaging structures which are recyclable. But it doesn't stop there. And I think that's really where what is important, what has been missing from the discussion so far, is that even if a product is recyclable, that doesn't mean it's actually recycled. It means investment, into waste management. It means the collection and sorting needs to be up to scratch. And in Western Europe, that would really be the sorting and enabling these waste streams to ultimately then flow back into the recycled contents or as recycled contents for packaging structures. But for emerging geographies, this is really setting up from the ground up waste management systems. So just recyclability alone will not solve it. The other element is policy. We also need the clear commitment and motivation of governments to be able to be willing to push forward the right frameworks which enable both that investment in the infrastructure for waste management, but also drive the uptick of recycled content within these packaging structures, and inevitably will have some impact also on some virgin plastics clear.
Thank you, Marco, for those comments. And I think what you said was quite interesting, that plastic is still quite an attractive material to use, but we need to still design for with end of life in mind. And I guess that is a good segue to our next segment on the reuse of products made from plastic. So, Richard, I want to come to you. In some of the conversations we've had before, you said it is entirely feasible to have most of the societal benefits that plastic can bring without the current levels of environmental harm, and about using plastics more responsibly. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Well, it is back to the points that we've discussed already. The only way you can really use plastics more responsibly is to design with that in mind, and whether it's reduce, reuse, or recycle. And I agree with the other speakers. We have to think about those things together. I mean, yes, there's been a push towards lightweighting to reduce CO2 emissions, but at the same time, that could compromise functionality, or it could compromise end-of-life recyclability. So it's about trying to optimize across the various different drivers from the design stage. And I also take the previous point, about recyclable. Now, that's a term in theory. We need to design for recyclability in practice. I mean, just to give an example, that's a red bottle made of PET. PET as a polymer we've known for decades is highly recyclable, but someone at the design stage has chosen to put a red pigment into that bottle. It doesn't do anything to help deliver the drink safely or securely. It perhaps achieves some brand differentiation on the shelf, but the problem for the recycler is the inclusion of that red pigment has approximately halved the economic value in recycling. So the designer here, in this example, has taken a highly recyclable polymer and rendered it very challenging to actually recycle. So the design stage is key to make sure that we can have the benefits. And to me, it isn't about making a paper bottle. I think PET is a very good way to ship drink, but we need to make sure that we've got the collection infrastructure and that is driven by economic models that will help to ensure that collection works and that recycling works. And putting the red pigment in there is actually disincentivizing the recycling. So to me, the design is absolutely essential. Whether it's reduce, reuse, or recycle, we've got to design with end of life in mind. And we also need to be cognizant that end of life will be very different in a highly developed nation with sophisticated waste collection and sorting infrastructure like North America and Europe than it would be in an emerging economy. So we need to design for end of life, but also considering where that end of life might take place. We're not talking about hundreds of different permutations. We're talking about hypothetically a couple of dozen to significantly increase or reduce, if you like, the potential for end-of-life impacts by better design.
Great. So, look, I think we've established thinking about end-of-life in design is essential. So how do we go about that? So I want to turn to Burgess on this. So to enable more responsible use of plastics, then, how can companies foster this kind of thinking around design? What kind of structures or teams do you have at PepsiCo to foster such thinking?
Yeah. So we have a one of our commitments and goals at PepsiCo is to have 100% of our packaging be recyclable, compostable, or biodegradable. And that really hits on what we've been discussing here, the design component. But that, as we've highlighted, just because it's designed to be recyclable doesn't mean it actually gets recycled. And the way we think about it is we have a program as part of our innovation process called Sustainable from the Start. And as we're looking at innovation or any types of product changes, we want to make sure that we're thinking about the full life cycle assessment end to end, including carbon, water, and packaging end of life. And we engage cross-functionally with all of the key teams, marketing to ensure that we're getting the consumer perspective and understanding the consumer behavior, the sustainability office to ensure we've got the environmental perspective, the R&D team to make sure that we get combined for environmental and packaging and product quality assurance that we need. But I think you can't just, as we've highlighted, you can't just have that design component for things like recyclable. You have to think about the entire life cycle assessment, because something like plastic is incredibly efficient and highly effective when you're thinking about low carbon emissions, especially when you're using recycled plastics. But that's not the only solution. And the way we think about it is to make sure that we're holistic in the life cycle assessment and thinking about carbon and water and truly the end of life in that process throughout, before any product gets to shelf.
Okay, thank you, Burgess. Marco, I want to turn to you on this discussion of reuse as well, and I'm curious about the role of of the plastic material that's produced. So, of course, Dow is a leading producer of polyethylene that goes into making single-use plastic. Would it be fair to say that some of these plastic materials are not designed with the end in mind? What needs to change?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair comment. That's definitely, and I think both speakers before me have clearly articulated that. And that's exactly what needs to change. So what we're trying to do is really contribute to a circular economy in two ways. First of all, to really look at the ability to get that recyclable structure designed at the beginning, but it shouldn't really stop there. And we talked about that enough. So what really then needs to happen is, once these recycling streams are actually coming off the grounds, we need to be able to do something with these streams of raw materials and start to treat them as valuable raw materials. And that can be both from a mechanical recycling perspective, whereby plastic packaging is taken back and reused in new structures. And we're actively doing that today in, for example, applications like wherein PepsiCo is used with collation shrink, where bottles are shrunk together with a plastic film. But we're doing it in many other applications as well. But there's also applications where because of food contact approvals, you cannot do that, and you will need to come with virgin-like materials. And as such, there is the opportunity to use a chemical recycle. It's also called advanced recycling methods, whereby you use plastic waste which cannot be used for mechanically recycling and normally would be landfilled or incinerated, diverting that into those methods to get it back as a valuable stream to make virgin-like polymers with the same type of properties, and upping the overall content of recycle within these packaging structures as well. Those areas require significant innovation and investment, particularly when it comes to advanced or chemically recycling. And we believe that a company like Dow is well suited with the material science capabilities we have to play an important role to advance the use of recycle in food packaging structures.
Okay, thank you, Marco. It's interesting. I think there's a lot of development taking place in terms of advanced recycling, and that's going to be quite exciting. Burgess, before we move into talking a little bit more about recycling, I wanted to just ask you, maybe given your experience, what is the most exciting or innovative design that you've seen in terms of reuse of a plastic product or a product that requires plastic packaging? And it'll be interesting to see if Marco and Richard have seen anything interesting as well.
There's a couple that I think, in terms of reuse, we acquired SodaStream a couple of years ago, and I think that's a fantastic proposition for consumers to have sparkling water or sparkling beverages in their home. And I think it enables and really provides alternative solutions to the single-use plastic that works really well for many of our consumers. And I think that's a fantastic innovation. Related to that, we've got a product called SodaStream Professional, which allows the personalization, so further personalization of the product for the consumer that you can use in any package. A consumer, there's no requirement on packaging. It's a machine that enables consumers to take any type of package that they want to provide their beverage, and it's a really great solution when you're thinking about even additional models. And then we've got we recently launched in North America a one of our brands, Bubbly, has now a SodaStream solution, so it enables someone to enjoy the Bubbly brand in an at-home multi-serve offering. And I think, especially with SodaStream, that's, to me, one that has done tremendously well in terms of reuse, where you've got a lot of consumer interest, a lot of consumer demand. And I think that's one of the critical things that we need within any type of reuse model. If you're going to have a consumer switch to something that is oftentimes might require a behavior change or a new way of thinking or a new model, it's really important to make sure that anything out there will ultimately be adopted by the consumer.
Great, thank you. Those are quite exciting examples, Burgess. Thank you for sharing. I will move on to the next section because I'm just mindful of the time and I do have a lot more questions. So I do want to move into recycling a little bit more. And Richard, again, to set the scene for this section, it would be really great to hear from you what you think the biggest challenges are with recycling plastic today.
Well, again, I'm afraid I'm going to repeat the same point. It's the fact that we're not designing necessarily with that end-of-life recyclability in mind. And I highlighted it very clearly with the example of the red bottle, where we've taken a highly recyclable polymer, highly recyclable product, and we've rendered it unrecyclable economically. So that it's back, I'm afraid, to sound like a record that's stuck, it's back to the same point. We aren't really designing with end-of-life in mind. If I take an audience of recyclers, and I've spoken at conferences of recyclers, if I take them into the supermarket, it's almost by chance the products that they say, yes, I could recycle that. Yes, I could recycle that. It's not by design. And so it's only a small proportion that are really economically viable for them. And that has to change. The key people that need to come together really are the product designers and those that deal with end-of-life management, sorting, collection, and recycling. And in a way, if you're designing a new product and those end-of-life people say, yeah, I could deal with that, I could make it economically viable to turn that into a new product in the circular economy, then that's the test. The only other thing I just sort of throw in here is that I think we've got to consider these measures absolutely as part of the waste hierarchy. I mean, I hear from many big organizations that, yeah, they're designing for recyclability and compostability and biodegradability, but those things have very different requirements for them. For reuse, we're looking about durability of the plastics. With recyclability, we're not looking for degradable plastics going into the recycle stream. So we need to be sure that we're applying these solutions in the right context, because otherwise there are conflicting interests. And most times we want the plastic to be reliable and dependable, not to be rapidly degradable. So it's about using these approaches appropriately. And I think there's a need there within the waste hierarchy for us to drill down a little bit more. To just go a little bit beyond saying, our strategy is we're going to design for recyclability or compostability or degradability, and give it a little bit more context so that we can say in these contexts, we're majoring on recyclability. In these scenarios, it's about compostability, because of course that's going to rely on the consumer having a compostable waste stream available to them, which many don't. And then if it's biodegradability, what context are we talking about there? I'm hoping that we're not thinking that the solution is designing plastics with the natural environment as our planned disposal route, that it will be okay to throw them into the natural environment without caring about them. So it's about thinking of those strategies that all have a place, but making sure we drill down and we've worked out where and when they fit. And that can only be solved by thinking about it from the design stage.
Thank you. But thank you for adding to that. No, I think we've emphasized how important that is. Marco, I don't know if you want to respond to any of that. You've touched on, how the different types of materials that can be used, and I think you touched on recycling. But anything more you want to add in terms of how plastic materials can be produced or designed differently to enable recycling specifically, given probably the most problematic waste streams?
Yeah, I think Richard made a really good point that we need to sit down holistically with the key influencers and decision makers who ultimately decide what's going to be the route for enabling the recycling. And that's exactly what we do in Pack Studio. There we bring together the whole value chain throughout, and with that network of Pack Studios throughout the world. We have that ability to do that globally because the solution will be regional. And this was mentioned earlier by one of the speakers already. You don't need the same solution in Asia as you may need here in Switzerland or in the Netherlands. So one of the things we did, and I can show you an example actually, which is a pouch, which is a recyclable pouch, which used to be made from a very complex multi-layer material plastic, which could not be recycled and ended up either in landfill or incineration. This pouch, which is in the market today, is recyclable, and as a result can then add to the value of those recycling streams, which can be taken back into mechanical recycling or into advanced recycling. But I think the important point here is as well is that it's not just about again making it recyclable, but having the overall policies and everything in place to make it a reality. Because I can stand here all day long as Dow, and I can make any packaging structure recyclable. With the innovation we put to bear, the investments we have in the resources, we can do that. But unless holistically we all collaborate, including governments, and put the policies in place to make it a reality, it will not happen. And unfortunately, I will say that unless we get mandatory recycled content, which will drive a lot of the economics in the whole circle and the chain, this will not become a reality. So although the European Commission, as an example, wants us to step up, they need to step up themselves as well and show some leadership with some of those mandatory recycle targets which they're putting out there, and providing a very clear roadmap to the industry. Because then at that point, brand owners, converters, recyclers can work together. Now we're all waiting a little bit for each other. We're ready, but the rest of the industry is not really willing to move.
Next time we need to have someone from the Commission to respond to that. But thank you for that. And I do want to talk about collaboration. I think you raised an important point there. Burgess, maybe we'll use this next question to transition into that as well. I would like to first maybe hear a little bit more about how PepsiCo is ensuring that packaging does not become waste and focusing on recycling, but maybe touching a little bit on the interaction you're having with waste collection and recycling companies to drive progress in this.
For sure. And I think PepsiCo, we have a vision where plastic never becomes waste, and we play a role in all aspects of that cycle. We've already talked a lot about design and the work that we do in upfront to ensure that the package is designed to be recyclable, compostable, or biodegradable. But as we've said, that's only just the start. So from there, not only from design, but we have to ensure that there's infrastructure for recycling and the collection of these materials. We've invested over 65 million for working with partners in local, and as we've highlighted, this is a very local solution. So working with partners at a local level to drive recycling and collection infrastructure to support the circularity. But we know that just having that infrastructure is not enough. We need the consumer to actually ensure that they are disposing of the materials properly. And that's where consumer education plays a huge role. And as a brand company, our brands can engage in that and help educate consumers. And we're working pre-competitively with many of our partners, including in the US, Coca-Cola, as part of the American Beverage Association, on a campaign that we call Every Bottle Back, which is aiming to bring back all of the PET bottles that are in the US, because the recycling rates in the US are really honestly not where they really should be. And then now that we've got the consumer recycling, we want to make sure that we are bringing back that material. And as Marco highlighted, that requires mechanical and even enhanced recycling solutions. And we are one of the largest buyers of recycled PET today. And as we've highlighted, getting material back into food grade contact is very challenging and often not prohibited. It can be prohibited in many geographies. And if we could use more of it, we absolutely would. And that's where you really have to have all of those components and all of the partnerships at each of those steps in order to be able to close that loop. Because without that kind of end-to-end holistic effort and collaboration, you end up with the packaging not being as circular as it really could and should be.
Thank you, Burgess. So, Marco, I want to turn to you next as well about the issue of about collaborating better. And I think in these efforts, we all have a role to play. We all bring something to the table. And I want to know, from your perspective, what Dow can offer in terms of these efforts to think about end of life in terms of design. What can you bring that other stakeholders cannot?
I think what's important, what Dow can bring to the table, is a material science capability with decades of experience in polymer know-how, whereby the existing packaging structures have been optimized with respect to a certain form of functionality, but not to the end of life. And here is where there is radical innovation needed to be able to make them ready. Dow is certainly able, through that know-how, to provide that. We also have the resources and commitment to put behind the actual recycling, which we discussed earlier on, like mechanical recycling or the advanced recycling. We're going one step further in that respect, that we have a vision whereby we would like to become the leading provider of circular solutions, but not just circular solutions at the lowest possible CO2 emissions, because the two are not mutually exclusive. They go together, they go hand in hand, because it can't be that we move away from one packaging structure to another and forget to look or don't want to look at CO2 or other resource intensity like water, as Burgess mentioned. And I think that's incredibly important. We also took a leading role in the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. We were one of the founding members of that alliance to help address, particularly in the emerging geographies, the waste management and how that's being set up and how that's being dealt with today, with a significant commitment from many industry players and value chain players who came to the table and stepped up to be able to address this issue, which clearly, let's be very clear, plastics don't belong in the environment, and that needs to be addressed. We all want to do that. But this needs a concerted effort holistically across the whole chain, and non-individual company can solve that. But we need to come together.
Absolutely. And in coming together, Richard, I want to ask you about what you think the role of government should be here, particularly in encouraging companies, whether it's plastic producers or packaging companies, to think about end of life. How can governments go about that? Do they offer incentives, or is it penalties? Is it the carrot or the stick?
I think it's probably a mixture that are needed. I agree completely that financial instruments, policy instruments to incentivize recycled content is a really good, likely to be a really good economic driver. But we may also need, some stick tactics, some fines to penalize companies that are perhaps not moving in the right direction. I think the collaboration more broadly is really, really important. And it's also about thinking about it in the round to make sure we don't lead to unintended consequences. And the point that you just made, Marco, about CO2 emissions and plastic. I remember talking a few years ago to a really big UK retailer that wanted to move all of their plastic content that was in their control over to biologically sourced carbon, to bioplastics, carbon grown in agriculture, because they saw it as a renewable carbon source. And yet, really, the main outcry about the problem is the problem of the end of life. The carbon source is almost irrelevant in that particular scenario, and shifting to something that looked good from a carbon footprint perspective did absolutely nothing to fix the challenges of waste or recycling, because they hadn't thought about how the two might trade off. So we do need to think about it in relation to others. But the final, more broad point I think I want to make here is that, and it is about bringing together the sector, but I'm really curious to get the other panelists' views on how do we do that to see some of these problems off before they've become problems. The reason we're here speaking today is because there's a global environmental crisis of the accumulation of billions and billions of tons of end-of-life plastic in the ocean. It was a tipping point for many of the consumers, for politicians, and for industry as well. But we're almost trying to now shut the stable door after the horse is gone. If I think about, an example of the microbeads in cosmetic products that have now been banned in many countries. But the patent on the use of those small bits of plastic in cosmetics was filed 40 years ago. Did nobody in the industry ask the questions, where are all of these going? Why did it take environmental scientists like those in my team and other environmental researchers to sort of turn over these boulders and raise awareness about something that was known about? If I look at in the UK, the organisation WRAP have proposed a list of 8 problematic plastic products. But if I talk to the industry and I say, well, which of those problematic plastic items are news to you? Which ones were you unaware of? Well, no, we've always known that those were problematic plastics. So my point here is not to criticize the industry, but it's to say, how do we get a better working practice? Because all of these things have really become problems because of the growth in the human population. 1950s, we made 5 million tons of plastic globally. And it was probably okay to have the quantity that we used then, as some of it is throwaway and discardable. But that's not appropriate with today's human population. In short, we need a smarter way of thinking from the design stage to make sure that we're designing products appropriately going forward. So how do we bring everybody together? You said, Marco, you're waiting for policy now. And I think we need a strategy that will bring the players together much earlier on, and that we're no longer, with new products, whether they're plastic or not, trying to shut the stable door after the horse is gone. We need a much broader approach to extended producer responsibility to see these things off before they even become problems. And that to me is the challenge of collaboration. How do we do that so that you're not waiting for the policymaker, that we've had those discussions in a grown-up way right from the start?
Yeah,
thank you,
I agree
Richard.
with
I
you.
think you. Yeah, so sorry, Marco, if you want to comment in literally a minute, I'm down to 2 minutes on the clock. So if you have about a 30-second response to that would be good. Anything, Burgess, to respond to what Richard said about how we stay ahead? Again, 30 seconds, please.
Just to respond to what Richard said, I totally agree. We came to a point where everything came to a halt. And we have now absolutely a situation which is completely unacceptable. And with population growth still taking place, we need to make sure we get a lot smarter at how we deal with the problem. How do you exactly do that is incredibly complex, obviously, because there's a lot of different values and thinking at stake. Many people and stakeholders have different perspectives on how the solution should be resolved. And this is where I think it's incredibly important that at least from a geo perspective, when you talk about the European Union, where I'm located, that we have a very clear path forward where the European Commission sets that and avoids also that at that point, individual countries start to completely deviate from that, because you need a very consistent roadmap across the industry. I think we ultimately need, I'll call it almost a Marshall Plan, to turn around the situation we've got at the moment to be able to address that. And we're up for it. We're ready to discuss that. We're willing. We're trying to seek out those partnerships and those collaborations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists. I think we've had such a fruitful discussion. And I know, Richard, you've only, I think, kicked off what I think will be another hour's worth of discussion. But thank you to everybody. And thank you to our audience for listening in. Do stay tuned for the next session.